Listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
RT reports U.S. defense bill authorizes more Ukraine and Taiwan aid. The $858 billion bill includes at least $800 million in additional military aid to Kiev. And for insight into this, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time, and his latest book is entitled The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery, Jim Crow, and the Roots of American Fascism. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So U.S. lawmakers have reached a compromise on the National Defense Authorization Act, agreeing to approve $45 billion more in overall military spending in 2023 than Biden even requested. And they did this last year as well. I think it was 23 or 24 billion last year, as well as multiple provisions for new security assistance to Ukraine and increased cooperation with Taiwan. Dr. Horne, you can't get clean drinking water in Flint, Michigan. You get it intermittently in Jackson, Mississippi. But we've got another $45 billion that we can send to Ukraine. Sir, I don't understand this. Can you help me out?
Well, the worst, I'm afraid to say, may be on the way if the majority in Congress has its way. What I mean is, you may have noticed these news stories about drone attacks into Russia, 450 miles from the Ukraine-Russia border. This is a clear escalation, and in some ways is contrary to what some of us expected in the wake of the phone call from Chancellor Scholz in Berlin to Moscow, in wake of the conciliatory words of President Macron during his recent visit to Washington. I think that it's long past time for some of our friends to stop the celebrations, or at least to reconsider the celebrations about the Democrats holding on to their majority in the Senate, and begin to think a bit more deeply and intently about what that may mean in terms of international peace and security, what that may mean with regard to the life chances of people in the United States, not to mention people worldwide, as this small planet hurtles towards a potential catastrophe. And in any case, from the geopolitical perspective of U.S. imperialism, this escalation in Russia hardly makes sense. It's somewhat incoherent. I think that analysts of the future, when they look back, assuming that there will be humanity still existent, when they look back at this period, they will be baffled and befuddled by the contradictory discourse. That is to say, China is certainly in the crosshairs. You even have the spectacle of the self-proclaimed North Atlantic Treaty Organization going against its charter and trying to extend its remit to Northeast Asia, speaking of Beijing. But at the same time, once again, you see U.S. imperialism getting bogged down in Russia, just as it was bogged down with the so-called war on terrorism as China was rising to preeminence. And it makes one wonder if there is a kind of phony Cold War taking place with regard to China. I don't think there is, but certainly I can understand the suspicions, because if China is truly in the crosshairs, then why all of this focus on Russia? And in any case, with regard to China, we all know that despite all of this talk about U.S. corporations decoupling from the Chinese economy, so far it's been mostly talk. And in any case, with regard to Taiwan, which China claims as its own and the United States sees as an unsinkable aircraft carrier off the coast of China, the recent elections there gave a severe setback to the pro-U.S. party. And so that's going to make even more difficult sledding for U.S. imperialism in terms of confronting China. So if I were in the think tank at the White House trying to come up with a coherent policy, imperialist policy, pro-imperialist policy, it would not be the policy that is currently being pursued.
Dr. Horne, let me ask you this in light of those elections. There are those of us who suspect that the U.S. was trying to drag, actually bait China into attacking Taiwan, kind of having the same kind of Ukraine dynamic so they could tell all of their ostensible allies, now we have to put all of these sanctions against China. However, China's looking at Taiwan saying, hey, the elections went our way, which really simply says the majority of the people in China are good with the status quo and they don't want to move towards this confrontational independence movement. So that gives them some time. We also see European Council Chief Charles Michel, I believe. He's going to China. That's sending a message that the U.S. is, some of the major countries in the EU are balking at joining this anti-China mission. And Xi Jinping is in Saudi Arabia at the request of Mohammed bin Salman. If you're China, you're not forced to act right now. Things are kind of falling in order in your direction. Your thoughts, Dr. Horne?
Well, you may have solved the puzzle that I sketched. That is to say, U.S. imperialism may be determining that it could not credibly confront China unless it has Russia under its belt. In light of those news items you just referenced, and of course you could have mentioned the visit of Chancellor Scholz of Berlin to China a few weeks ago, the visit of the leader of Vietnam to China a few weeks ago. Of course, Vietnam and China, despite both being ruled by communist parties, have had fraught relations in recent decades, not to mention recent centuries. And so perhaps the answer to the quandary is that U.S. imperialism feels that it could not credibly confront China unless Russia is flat on its back and under the domination of Washington, as was the case during the Yeltsin years. And that may also help to explain the EU journeys to Beijing as well, because they figured that out also. But let me warn the hawks in Washington that they're playing a very dangerous game, that they're playing with fire. There's little evidence to suggest that their original early 2022 plan of battering the Russian economy, turning the ruble into rubble, as Mr. Biden put it, is actually working out. And it's more than a notion to confront the 11th largest economy on planet Earth with reputedly the largest arsenal of nuclear weapons and get it to cry uncle and to bend the knee. So there seriously needs to be a reconsideration of the fundamentals of the foreign policy of U.S. imperialism.
And don't forget regime change, that Putin's got to go. Don't forget that one. This man cannot stay. Yeah. I hope I can put this together succinctly. The NDAA, they approved $45 billion more than Biden requested. I want to say last year it was somewhere around 25, 28 billion more that they threw into the pot. If we go back to the Reagan administration and its whole escalation of defense spending at the sake of social safety net programs in this country, trying to bankrupt the Soviet Union at the time into escalating defense spending, is the United States now falling victim to its own trap? That it did partially work against the Soviet Union, but now with the United States continuing these escalations that it cannot afford at the sake of domestic infrastructure, is the United States falling victim to its own trap?
And I might also add, in terms of falling victim to its own trap, that as you suggested a moment or two ago, that policy was designed to bankrupt the former Soviet Union, and it worked to a certain degree, but it also gave China a free pass to enter the passing lane, where it remains to this very day. And it's seeming to be the case that that's what's happening now. That is to say that Washington somehow cannot pull up its socks and get its act together and go mano a mano with the People's Republic of China, perhaps because it knows that that's a losing game. And so, once again, scholars of the future may well determine that there's a kind of phony war taking place right now in 2022. But what's interesting is that the Republicans certainly have expressed some discontent with the Ukraine policy. Recall that perhaps the incoming speaker, potentially incoming speaker, Mr. McCarthy of California, has said that there's no blank check to Ukraine. They want to go all in with regard to China. But it's unclear if, because of their rank unpopularity, that they will have the opportunity to pursue that policy, which in any case is a losing policy all of its own.
The polls now seem to be going in a bad direction for the neocons. 47% of Americans believe their government should push Ukraine to reach a peace agreement with Russia as soon as possible. We looked at some other numbers, and here was my here was my thought. It's interesting that you would get numbers this high in light of the nonstop barrage of propaganda in the other direction. Your thoughts, Dr. Horne?
Well, I think that perhaps a significant percentage of the U.S. population is in sync with some of your earlier comments. That is to say, the dearth of potable drinking water in Flint, Michigan, the intermittent potable drinking water in Jackson, Mississippi, the gun violence, the attack on women's reproductive freedom, the failures of K through 12 education, the unemployment. And many people feel that there should be, if anything, rebuilding the United States of America, as opposed to all of these imperialist gambits. And that may be reflected in those poll numbers. Recall that during the recent hurricane in Florida, you had a distressed homeowner raise and unfurl a Ukraine flag, feeling that that would bring him aid quicker and sooner. I think that that captures, I'm afraid to say, where we are at this moment in history.
It's interesting. They in this same RT story, they talk about an equal percentage of Americans told pollsters they believed either Moscow or Kiev was winning the conflict. And they say of those who believe that Kiev is winning the conflict, 65% support sending weapons to Ukraine. Well, we just did a story yesterday talking about how the weapons that were on their way to Ukraine now find themselves in African countries, but and they also consider the consistent levels of economic aid at 66% and accepting Ukrainian refugees at 73%. All of these issues are proven to be false, so or to be very problematic, to say the least. So to Garland's point, this propaganda is still very effective in impacting the minds and thoughts of a lot of Americans.
Well, we could have said the same thing about the propaganda with regard to the war in Indochina as of April, or I should say March 1975, with the United States being driven out in April of 1975. I'm afraid to say that because of the hysterical and concerted attacks upon progressives over the decades in this country, that it has affected the political education, or I should say, it has generated maleducation in in the deepest ranks of the U.S. electorate. However, the way that this war is going, which, as I said, is headed towards a catastrophe, it seems to me that irrespective of what the hawks may be cooking up at the State Department, that the United States is going to be forced to withdraw with its tail between its legs in Central and Eastern Europe, just like it was forced to withdraw with its tail between its legs in Indochina in the spring of 1975.
With the Ukraine having been carved up like a holiday turkey, if Poland gets the western part of Ukraine that they're asking for. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.